Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about reloading. Anyway, it's a great hobby. It's a good pastime. You know, a machine like this can help you knock out quite a few bullets in a hurry. I used to do everything by hand, kind of single staging everything. And like I said, since I got this, I figured I might as well try and figure out the progressive game here. I started making some of these videos earlier. The camera screwed up and it told me that there was an issue and all of my files got deleted. So I'm going to start over from scratch here. Notice, if you can probably notice that there's some bushings that are already on my dies. I'll take these loose so that way you can actually see how to put all this stuff together. And we'll kind of go from there. But on this particular press, it has these little shell plates that look like this. Anyway, these shell plates have a number that's on it. This one's a number 8, which is for 9mm, which is what we're going to kind of do today. On this, really, it's not that complicated. You notice there's a little indexing deal down here at the bottom that allows for this press to turn as it goes up and down. And you can see that little indexer moving, right? And so the big thing is, whenever you put this on there, it's got 2 ball bearings. The ball bearings go down. I've already lubricated the space, so it needs to have a little bit of oil or grease or something on it. And you just need to line up that little notch with the indexer that's actually on there. And then there's a little washer and a bolt. And so whenever you put this together, you don't really need to go crazy tightening anything down. It just needs to be snug, you know. So if you'll run it down like that, get it tight with your hands, make sure that the whole thing rotates, right? So it looks like it's doing pretty good. I'll run it back around to where the 8's on the right side. Anyway, but there's a couple of little things about this press, right? So this is technically your first stage, right? Which would be where you feed your brass. Grab a piece of brass here. You're going to feed your brass into that. And without a spring, the brass doesn't want to stay in there. It'll just flop in and out. You're gonna have to forgive the road noise. I live a little close to the highway, and so as people are driving up and down, sometimes they act like fools. But anyway, there's just a little spring that goes inside this. So the spring just goes around and pops right in. And that's actually what holds you around in there. But you notice there's a little groove right there, and that spring has to get down into that groove, and there it goes. And so it only took a couple of little turns, right, and it gets that spring down inside that groove. And so now if I press this bill, it actually holds that case from flopping out. I need a new one of these springs. This one's a little wore out, but it's good enough for the purposes of what we're trying to do today. We'll run this back around, and whenever it gets to the last one, you notice it kicks that piece of brass back out. And so that is a once fired piece of brass, 9mm. And so I guess the next step is we need to start going. Let's figure out how we need to do these dies, and I'll show you how they set them up. And like I said, there's a few little interesting things about this particular press. That's what your dies look like, and so this is probably rudimentary for some people, but that's what the dies look like, and they're threaded. It's a pretty universal thread, but on this particular press, it won't go in there, and so you have to have this little bushing. So that little bushing has locks on it, right? And so we can just take that little bushing and drop it down inside there. And then this is what's called a decapping die and sizing die. I'm sure you can probably see that. There's a little piece that's sticking out the end there, and that's actually what pushes the old used primer out. And then the walls of this will actually resize the 9mm brass. 9mm is a tapered case, and so it has to have a special die. You can't use 380 dies on 9mm. If you do, I wouldn't recommend it. It's kind of dangerous. Anyway, but at the end of the day, there's a few things you want to look at on your die. One is you want to make sure that the inside is clean and that your decapping die is not bent. And so be prepared. At some point, you'll have to replace that. I've run into some stuff where maybe there's a stainless steel pin from cleaning or a piece of walnut or something like that, and you get it bound up against that and it'll just bend that pin right over. They are replaceable. This little nut on the top comes off. The pin comes out of that and you put the new pin on the inside. Some of the rifle dies though have an inside that's not universal. They actually have a little bulb on them, and so you got to be careful there. I like to set my decapping die to where they're flush here at the top. That's a good indicator as you're reloading. If you happen to push that against something, it'll push that thing up, hopefully before it breaks off that die, or before it breaks off that pin. And so if you're reloading and it starts to push it up, you'll see this rise above flush. And that's an indicator that something has gone wrong and that you need to stop doing what you're doing and start working on fixing that. So since we have our little piece kind of in there, we're going to run that die down inside there. And really what we want to do is you want to run this plate up to where it almost hits on that die. And so let me readjust the camera. I'll show you kind of what I'm talking about. Okay, so as you can see, there's a little bit of a gap from the bottom of the die. Hopefully you can see that pretty well. So the bottom of the die is sticking out and the shell plate goes up and it's just barely past that. And so what I like to do is run that die down. You just hold that ring, run that die down to where it just touches and then back it off just a hair. And we're going to tighten down that locking nut that's on the top of that. And so it should be just barely touching that shell plate, and that's exactly what we want, right? So just like that. So that way whenever we put a piece of brass in there, so here is a piece of once fired brass, still got a primer in it. So I'm going to slide it into the first deal, and as it starts to come up, you'll see the brass go up into that. And it actually pushes the primer out of there. And so let me take that out so that way you can actually see it. And so see, it's pushed the primer right out of that, and now you have an open primer pocket. And really that's about as easy as it is for the first stage. So the other trick that you need to remember is that you don't want that die set so low that it impedes the upward stroke of that center piston right here. And zoom out just a little bit. So, but you don't want to impede the stroke of the center piston. You want it to actually bottom out and your lever be all the way down, and that thing not be hitting. If it is, the other stations aren't quite going to work right. And so, now that we've got that decapping pin set the way that it is, we know that we can now probably move on to the next stage, which is actually going to be setting up the primer, the automatic primer assembly. And we can do that in another video. So I'm going to kind of end this here, just kind of talk about how to set up that decapping die and making sure that everything is set the way that it's supposed to. If there's a problem, the machine will kind of let you know. But for the most part, you just want to make sure that the stroke is all the way from the top to the bottom. And that is it hitting my bench. That is it not bottoming out on that die. All right, appreciate it, everybody.